Hello and welcome. In this first video lecture, we will be learning about research ethics and cultural relevance in research studies. Part 1 is about research ethics, and here we will be learning about some of the basics of research ethics such as voluntariness, comprehension, and disclosure. Back in the day, researchers could do some pretty extreme studies in the name of science. In the 1900s, we had the Milgram Experiment and the Zimbardo Prison Experiment, which are good examples of this. In the Milgram Experiment, as you may be familiar, they had participants listen to the screams of people in another room and were told to increase the amount of electric shocks they were given to a person while the person escalated their screaming to see how far a person would go before they quit the experiment. In the Zimbardo Prison Experiment, you had undergraduate students, I believe, at Stanford University in a basement there, who are divided into roles of prisoners and prison guards to see how those students would take on those roles over the period of a week. Both of these studies likely caused subjects distress, yet gave us valuable information about the human condition. However, on the flip side, out of concern for research participants, increased oversight and regulation of research has been in place since about the 1970s. Today, when conducting research, extensive thought must be given to ensuring a study is ethical, meaning it treats participants in a humane manner. The Belmont Report created basic ethical principles and their applications in research, making sure that the subjects of a research study were able to give their voluntary informed consent to participate as part of a research study, that they could comprehend their role as part of the research study, and that they were able to give disclosure, or at least to receive disclosure about what the intent was of the research study. While research contributes to the well-being of society, it helps us to solve problems, to understand phenomena better. Putting living beings at risk is not to be taken lightly. This is particularly true for vulnerable populations who do not always understand informed consent, such as children, the elderly, and people with significant intellectual disabilities. It is more difficult to conduct ethical research on these populations because they are not always able to give informed consent. And therefore you will see fewer research studies with children, with the elderly, and with people with significant intellectual disabilities. Informed consent is the ability to freely participate in research without coercion, after being provided with the purpose, benefits, and risks of participating. If a person gives informed consent, they should still be able to withdraw without penalty at any time. When reporting the results of research, there are also several ethical approaches that should be followed. The first is a way to avoid, if possible, the file draw phenomenon, which is when if you conduct, say, 10 research studies and only one of those has significant findings, that you publish that one significant finding, that one study, and throw away the other 9 studies. You should try to be publishing all of your studies if possible. This is not always possible because a lot of journals will not want to publish insignificant findings, but they are important because it gives a better sense for whether or not something is indeed useful or effective. In addition, when you are reading through a research article, particularly the methodology section, you should be able to understand the methods used in the study and be able to what's called replicate the way in which the study was conducted by following the same methodology. If their methodology is unclear or a lay reader is not able to follow how the research was conducted and how it could be replicated, it is not considered the most credible form of research, because in the end research is really about adding to the literature and making sure that others are able to come out later on after you and conduct the same kinds of research to further to I guess to further the field uh, uh, even after your own work. The ACA Code of Ethics in their 2014 edition, and also the earlier editions, also provides us with guidelines in terms of research evidence when providing counseling services. This is directly from the ACA Code of Ethics. When providing services, counselors use techniques, procedures, and modalities that are grounded in theory and/or have an empirical or scientific foundation, meaning, hopefully, the kinds of approaches that you are using have some kind of empirical or research support. Counselors do not use techniques or procedures or modalities when substantial evidence suggests harm, even if such services are requested. This is an important parameter by the American Counseling Association. Even though there are very few modalities that have been proven to have substantial evidence suggesting harm, these are important to know about, and you should not be providing those to clients because of the potential for causing harm. One of the most famous examples of this is what has been known as rebirthing therapy, which is when you hold down a person and actually cover their face with a pillow in order to, reconjure memories of early childhood trauma. Now, of course, several people died as a result of asphyxiation, suffocation through the use of this pillow, and that's why there is substantial evidence that it can be a harmful approach and should not be used. So even if a client comes to you and says, I would like rebirthing therapy, please, you should not be providing that to them. Okay, so we looked at some of the ethical parameters around research, and that's important to learn about as we start our journey into understanding research in counseling. The second is cultural relevance, also very important to understand when we are starting to evaluate counseling studies, especially in regards to how culturally relevant they are. It is another significant issue in the ethical realm that most research studies in counseling have an underrepresentation of cultural groups. In most randomized controlled trials, meaning in true experiments, as you'll be learning about next week, there are homogeneous groups, for example, people with depression, and depression only, no other diagnoses, that is not fully representative of what happens in actual practice settings, because when you go out into the field and you work in practice, typically you are going to be providing services to people with multiple diagnoses, more than just depression, more than just one diagnosis. But research studies try to avoid studying more than one diagnosis at a time, because that can affect the results. It can introduce what's called confounding to the data. By having your results, it could be that the person has other diagnoses that are causing them to either get better or not. So research studies tend to dislike having multiple diagnoses as part of the same study, but that can also limit the ability for a research study to be fully representative of your work. Another form of underrepresentation, and one that is also very important, is when minority groups are underrepresented in samples. And when this happens, we have to ask, can this study have implications for people of diverse or minority backgrounds? In prior years, this was wrongly assumed, that it didn't really necessarily matter. As long as this therapy was found to be effective, then it was presumed to be useful for different cultural groups. Well, that may not actually be true. And this is a major problem, because many randomized controlled trials or true experiments in the counseling and psychotherapy literature have an underrepresentation of different minority groups. Since 1986, more than 10,000 participants have been involved in randomized controlled trials, yet only 7% of them were classified non-white. This is not representative of the population, of the US population, and therefore we have to ask, is that research evidence useful when we have a client that we're working with who is from a non-white background? We are now starting to see more studies emerge that have clients from different cultural groups as part of the studies that are representative of the population, or studies that are specific to that cultural group, meaning you might have, for example, the use of cognitive behavior therapy, with, say, the African American, male African American adolescents, let's say. So you get more specific kinds of studies now which are more useful than the underrepresentation we've had in the past. A study's findings are culturally relevant when the cultural background of the client in front of you is included in the normative sample group, as I just mentioned. In the figure in front of you, you can see here there are three groups: Caucasians, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. And it's important to look at whether or not, let's say, the amount of, let's say, Hispanic Americans is adequately represented in that sample compared to the overall population norms. Let's use another example. Let's say we have a client we're working with who is an African American, heterosexual, middle-aged single mother of working class status. So I want you to imagine you're working with that client, and you want to find some research that might be useful when working with that client. Culturally relevant studies have a stratified sample group of African Americans and women. So stratified sampling is when you take you make sure that as part of your sample you have a certain percentage who are African Americans and women, and that percentage matches the overall population norms. So let's say you have 20% of the population who are African American. I'm just throwing out that number. That 20% of your sample is also African American. That's just an example of stratified sampling. The most relevant studies also contain in their sample group heterosexual single mothers and mothers of working class status. This is hard to find, as you imagine, to find studies that are this specific. But certainly, if you do find studies like that, they are going to be more representative and more useful to you than studies that lack that information or do not adequately represent those kinds of cultural variables. In this example, it could be most useful to have an entire sample group of African American heterosexual single mothers of working class status as part of a study, though again you would be fortunate to find a study with such a representative sample, unfortunately. But that's the kind of studies that you would be looking for if you wanted to ensure your study was that the research you found was culturally relevant. You would be looking specifically at the representation of different cultural groups within the sample used of the study. So, you've just reached the review. We went through research ethics and cultural relevance today, and we will be learning about in class the history of psychotherapy. This concludes your video lecture.